Welcome to Newt's World Podcast on the iHeart Podcast Network. I want to take a minute as we are talking about the tax season. April 15th is the classic American day when all of us look at the federal government and realize that that's where a lot of our money went. And there's some fascinating things going on. The one big beautiful bill passed July 4th last year is actually working. And that's important. Remember, the theory of the one big beautiful bill is that if we reduce taxes, leave more money in your pocket, allow small businesses in particular to have more resources so they can grow, hire more people, that in fact the economy will get better. And if you'll notice, despite all the problems, despite the war with Iran, despite the challenges of getting oil out of the Strait of Hormuz, the economy overall has been remarkably strong and remarkably stable, and we keep adding jobs. And remember, when you see those job numbers, that's after reducing the federal employment by 350,000 people. So we're actually adding so many private sector jobs that we are more than making up for the degree to which the Trump administration has shrunk the federal bureaucracy. But let me just give you some examples. This year, the Internal Revenue Service is issuing higher refunds with an average of about $3,462, which is about 10% more than last year. Last year, they gave out $3,116. The bigger refund checks reflect the major tax cuts passed in the One Big Beautiful Bill. And remember, it's not just the tax cuts and the refunds in the short run, but no tax on tips is going to be a huge break for millions of Americans who work hard. No tax on overtime is a big break, including, for example, for emergency workers where there are hurricanes or earthquakes or forest fires and they have to work overtime. And now they won't have to pay taxes on the overtime they're earning. There are a huge increase in the child tax credit, so families with children will have more resources to raise their children. There are a number of things happening in the tax area. Almost all of them are for higher income, greater investment, more jobs, and a more prosperous American future. So it's sort of useful this April to stop, take stock, and realize that, in fact, we are turning the corner towards a more prosperous, healthier, and dramatically economically better off America. Coming up, I'm joined by Dr. Greg Ganske, former congressman who represented Iowa's 4th District. His recent op-eds on online sports betting caught my attention. I am really pleased to welcome my guest, Dr. Greg Ganske, former member of Congress representing Iowa's 4th District, very good personal friend who I've spent a lot of time with over the years, a retired plastic and reconstructive surgeon, a retired U.S. Army Reserve lieutenant colonel, and frankly, one of the smartest people I've ever worked with an amazing background. And he's got some ideas that have me intrigued. Greg, welcome, and thank you for joining me on Newt's World.
Well, thank you, Newt, for having me on. It's really nice to talk to you.
You did 2 recent op-eds. One, sports are too important to be ruined by betting. And the second one, internet betting is a bad bet and a public health crisis. I read all of your stuff. These 2 really caught my attention. Frankly, I have a deep, traditional, conservative bias about betting in general as a terrible misuse of money and also teaching people the wrong things about life. But in particular, we've seen this explosion of online sports betting, and now we have this whole prediction markets betting thing. I'm really delighted that you're raising this issue because I think we ought to look very closely at both of these industries. You argue that sports are foundational to personal development. In your judgment, what do young people gain from sports that they really can't get anywhere else?
Well, part of the reason that I'm concerned about this betting problem is because I think sports are so important. They're important to the development of young people. They teach discipline, teamwork, working hard to goals. And I think the lessons that you learn on the playing fields, what was it? Wellington, who said Waterloo was won on the playing fields of Eton. I think that's still true. And all you have to do is look at how important sports is in our society. It's multi-trillion-dollar industry. And the thing that concerns me about the betting is that sports is dependent on trusting the integrity of the results. If people start questioning who wins and who loses and whether this pitch that is thrown into the dirt is now possibly caused by somebody trying to throw the game, you're going to lose with young people the respect for sports that they should have, and you're going to significantly hurt all the benefits of sports for all generations. I mean, here in Iowa, we don't have a professional sports team, but a lot of people follow professional sports. They pick a team, and it helps build the sense of community in following that team. And it cuts across all economic classes and is exceedingly important for, I think, encouraging a sense of community. And all these things are at risk if sports is deemed as not being honest. We just had an example in the Winter Olympics where this French ice skating judge gave the French pairs team an unbelievably high score, which caused them to beat the American team. And everyone who watched the competition questioned that judge's grading. And this has gone on in the Olympics for quite a while. But when you throw in huge amounts of money that could result in people unfairly winning betting amounts of money, I think it just magnifies the problem that we have in many different sports with how the refs call the game.
You approach it from both sides, though, in that you also raise the issue that some significant number, maybe 2 to 4 million Americans, actually have gambling addiction. And in a sense, putting all this online empowers that addiction and increases the amount of undermining of their lives by making it so easy.
Yeah. Under the medical diagnostic codes, there's a classification for a gambling addiction. And basically it defines a person who has persistent and recurrent problems of gambling that causes, loss of control, economic disaster, chasing losses to try to get even, lying to families, risking their jobs, going bankrupt. And that's maybe 2 to 4 million Americans. But there's another risk, which is not quite so severe. And that's, you could add another 10 million Americans who are very close to a gambling addiction. But the interesting thing is that about 60% of bettors account for just about 1% of the sportsbook revenue. But that leaves 99% of the sports bet revenue coming from 40% of bettors. And so there's this huge gray area of millions of Americans, particularly young men, but even many young women today also, who have what we would call problematic gambling behavior. And they have mood swings, increased rates of anxiety, obsessions, intrusive thoughts. They're more likely to miss classes, drink alcohol, do other risky behaviors. And I think this really kind of hit home for me when I was watching some of the March Madness games with my brother and sister. They both have several daughters who are in their early 20s. And they were talking about how their daughters' boyfriends would come over and they'd be watching the games, and the guys would be on their cell phones all during the game placing bets on what immediately is going to happen. And both my sister and brother said they've strongly advised their daughters not to continue dating those guys. But this addiction is interesting because physiologically for the individual, it's been shown that the act of gambling causes increased dopamine release in the brain. And that's similar to the type of thing that happens when you take opioids. You get a release of dopamine, and it gives you this sort of sense of euphoria. But for gambling, it's interesting because it happens not just when you win, but it happens when you lose. That may be part of the reason why it's well known that people tend to, chase their losing bets. And so there's a physiological component to this. You don't have a physical withdrawal like you might from alcohol, but you definitely can have a psychological withdrawal. And so this is a problem, it's a problem for individuals. It's a problem for state governments, the national government. It's a problem globally because globally, a recent report by Lancet showed that about 450 million people in the world are betting very frequently. I think this is something that we need to start looking at in terms of a real health problem. This is a problem of national health and international health concern.
When we come back, the risk of sports betting and how that is changing the sports industry. You wrote that the benefits of sports hinges on its integrity. How do you see potentially that integrity being undermined by the sheer scale of money now being bet on games and on sports activities?
All you have to do is watch TV, and you can see, the ubiquitous gambling ads on TV, FanDuel and others. You see sports heroes like Rob Gronkowski pitching FanDuel. During the Super Bowl, Gronkowski was touting for FanDuel this deal where you could put a $5 bet down and double your money if he made a field goal during halftime. The gambling industry, the amounts of money, it's a little hard to calculate, but we're talking about probably close to $1 trillion. And globally, we may be talking about 850 million plus in losses. So the scale, and then all of these sports associations like the NBA and the NFL. And just the other day, I saw the PGA, the Professional Golf Association, entering into associations and contracts with these gambling entities. And the gambling groups, they say, well, this is just a matter of free speech, free activity. It doesn't amount to very much. But the sports leagues, Major League Baseball, others, they're making millions and millions off this association. And I just think it's really unhealthy because they're legitimizing this behavior, which can be very damaging.
When you have this sheer volume of money, the temptation for some athletes to somehow change their behavior for financial compensation becomes pretty amazing. And frankly, if you're already a professional anyway and you're playing to make money, the fact that you're going to make money differently undermines the sports ethos, but it doesn't necessarily undermine the income ethos.
Newt, we've had examples for a long time of cheating in sports. Pete Rose was banned for betting on his own team. He was betting that his own team would win. Remember when Rosie Ruiz jumped in halfway into the Boston Marathon? East Germans doped their athletes. Lance Armstrong was stripped of Tour de France titles. And we've had NBA betting scandals in the past, like in 2002 and 2007. So we've had these episodes of cheating in the past, but what is so much different now is this association between the ease of betting and gambling. All you need is a cell phone and a credit card. So you're then throwing huge amounts of money into the gambling problem, and there's a temptation then for cheating to now involve mega millions of dollars. So what have we had? Well, in October of 2025, the FBI exposed this gambling scandal that involved Coach Chauncey Billups and several players, and, mafia associates were using insider information to manipulate NBA bets. And over 30 individuals were charged. So now, every time when an NBA player misses a shot that could determine the game, you're wondering, well, wait a minute, was there a bet? Even more so, the point shaving that can go on. And I think this is a problem, not just at the very top, but for instance, in basketball with the March Madness, where you have the mid-majors, you have all these players who know that they're probably never going to play in the NBA. They're probably not getting much money from NIL. And so they're approached by these underworld figures and say, if you just don't play as hard the first half, so they can shave the point spread on the first half, then go ahead, Mr. Basketball player, go ahead and you play hard the rest of the game, and then you aren't really fixing the game. But they sure have fixed the betting for, let's say, what the spread would be at the end of the first half. This then is going to hit at whether the average person watching these sports can really think that this is an honest event. And I think that if people start thinking that it's not an honest event, then the sport loses a lot of its appeal.
You have the long-term degrading of the sport. I don't understand the entire transition in paying college athletes and then allowing them to switch colleges, etc. It's rapidly becoming so different from the world you and I grew up in. I remember somebody once said that you'd never get a modern baseball player to play with the intensity of players in the 1920s, because in the 1920s they weren't paid very much, and they were playing because they really liked baseball. And now you have such huge contracts, it's really dangerous for them to get too injured because the amount of money involved is so great. And that changes a lot, I think, of the tone of what we're discussing. Let me ask you about one other part of that, though, which is we've been talking about sports betting. Where are you on this whole emerging prediction markets betting with platforms like Kalshi and Polymarket?
I think it's huge because, again, it's combining our cell phones with an ease of betting. The average person spends about 4.5 hours a day on their smartphone. And then you make it so that you can bet before you get out of bed. You just grab your cell phone and then you go on a betting app. Well, then these entities like Kalshi and others are basically getting around the gambling rules by saying that what they're doing is they're creating a market. It's regulated by the government organization that controls futures and commodities, and the CFTC, which probably is not adequately able to control this. And so, you have every bit as much the possibility of cheating on these sites as well as with the sports betting. It has gotten to the point where, there's been bets on whether politicians could be assassinated, the results of elections. Well, Newt, we already know that there's huge incentives for abuse in elections, and then you throw in the gaming aspect to it, and it puts a lot of things at risk. So I would say that this is something that should also be addressed. In terms of what you were talking about with the sports thing, I think President Trump was right in terms of trying to put some limits on transfers of athletes and things like that. But I think that if you and I were back in Congress, we would be looking at trying to do something to handle this gaming problem, which is metastasizing to everything.
Coming up, what should Congress do to enact meaningful change in regulating the sports betting industry? Traditionally, and this is what makes this whole thing so weird. You look at a place like Las Vegas, casinos had real guardrails, and they had real state authorities, and they had controls about how much they could rig the game, etc. But now we're in a Wild West online, which reaches everybody. In a sense, when you regulate Vegas, you're regulating the people who can afford to go to Vegas. But now everybody has an opportunity in what is really a pretty unregulated environment. From your perspective, if you were in Congress, what would you be calling for?
There have been calls for regulating aspects of gambling. They just haven't become law yet. There's a law that's been proposed called the Bets Off Act, which would ban insider trading on these prediction markets that we were just talking about. There's a bipartisan bill that has proposed that at least 1/3 of the federal excise tax on sports wagers would go into supporting gambling addiction prevention and treatment services. There's another bill called the GRIT Act, which proposes setting aside 50% of federal sports excise tax for treatment and research at the NIH on gambling addiction. And, I think that's pretty important because the gambling interests have promoted some research on how gambling is not so bad. Obviously, they're paying for that research, and we need an independent group on that. I think that we should look at treating this as a public health problem like we've looked at tobacco and alcohol. I was involved with one of the early drafts for the Tobacco Regulation Act. We could do things like regulate advertisements on TV for gambling. You could require that players set annual loss limits. And you could have mandatory firewalls to prevent excessive borrowing. This one I'm sure would be really fought by the gambling industry, but you could prohibit the use of credit cards for gambling. And you should put strict age limits on who can gamble, and you should make sure that those age limits are verified. You could restrict ATMs from places like at some of the sports venues. They have special rooms in the stadiums. I think in New Jersey, there's a place, one of the stadiums has a special place where you can go and place your bets. Different things that we could do. But I want to emphasize, because this is a personal matter, and that is that a former congressman, Jim Leach, was a good friend of mine from Iowa. He passed a bill as the banking chairman that limited access to internet gambling by offshore entities, which were mainly organized crime. The gambling industry targeted Jim in his reelection that year, They mobilized to get out the vote effort of all the gamblers in his district, and he lost a close election by 6,000 votes, and I think it was due to that activity by the gambling industry. The gambling industry itself contributes something like $800 million a year to lobbying in Washington. And a study from a few years ago showed that more than half of the congressmen had received donations from gambling interests, especially the ones that are involved on committees that deal with gambling or could deal with gambling. And so this is something that, needs some public exposure, I think. When I ran for Congress, I told my fundraisers, I said, listen, we're not going to accept any contributions from the tobacco industry. And maybe we need a few politicians to make that same determination on the gambling donations as well. So to show how big this is in terms of doing something about gambling advertising is second only to, on TV, advertising for food products, i.e. all the restaurant ads, all the pizza ads that you see on the sports things, and gambling is right there with them. So, big problem.
Amazing. So let me ask one last question, which is, do you think we should focus on trying to have better regulations or on banning it?
I think that we should focus on regulation. I think that total bans would probably be something that goes to the Supreme Court. And I think the First Amendment issues get involved in this. So trying to devise some regulations that would meet constitutional requirements, I think is the best way to go. We have a problem with government and gambling because government makes money off gambling. And so there's a conflict of interest there. Every state has its lottery and everything else. And so none of these things would be easy to enact and would meet fierce opposition from the gaming industry, just like we had to deal with the tobacco industry, for instance. But I think the stakes are just too high to not do something.
I think your notion of having the right hearings, setting up the right research, there's a lot that can be done. The industry might fight, but I suspect the public would be very, very supportive. Listen, as always, I find talking with you amazing. You're a remarkable person. You've had an amazing career. I want to thank you for joining me today.
It was my pleasure.
And now I'm pleased to introduce a new segment to Newt's World, where I answer listeners' questions. To ask a question, please email me at newt@gingrich360.com. Wyatt H. asks, we all understand the reasons for the filibuster, but is it what our founding fathers agreed on, and is it really legal as per the Constitution? A filibuster is a tactic in the Senate, which is used to delay or block a vote on legislation by extending debate, requiring a 60-vote cloture majority to proceed. It actually originates from an 1806 rule change. It forces bipartisan compromise and protects minority party rights, though is often criticized for causing gridlock. George Washington, in explaining why the Senate was important to Alexander Hamilton, said to him that the Senate should be the cooling saucer to the hot cup coming out of the House. And by that he meant the Founding Fathers wanted the system to be slower. They wanted to protect freedom. They did not trust majorities running amok and doing whatever they wanted. And they would prefer the problems we have today to the problems of a dictatorship. I think, frankly, while I'm a member of the House, was a member of the House, and I think like a House member where things are fast and 218 votes passes things, for the sake of the country's stability, it's actually helpful to have a Senate that slows things down a little bit, makes it a little harder, and frankly, that's good for freedom. And it's frustrating, but that frustration is the price of freedom. I look forward to hearing from you. To ask a question, please email me at newt@gingrich360.com. Thank you to my guest, Dr. Greg Ganske. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcast and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Join me on Substack at gingrich360.net. I am Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.